The movie opens with a mysterious scene featuring a parchment last will and testament. The document is carefully folded, sealed with wax, and imprinted with the family crest, bearing the name Van Garrett. An elderly man, dressed in elegant clothing of the era, boards a carriage emblazoned with the same family name. As he gazes out into the dark night, he is uncomfortable by the sight of a menacing scarecrow. Suddenly, the piercing sound of a horse's bray startles him. Then, a sharp, sickening noise reverberates through the air, causing the old man to look out the window, only to discover his coachman, now headless, struggling with the horses. Terrified, the old man flees into a cornfield, disoriented and panicked. Before he can gather his wits, a sinister, unseen figure emerges and swiftly decapitates him. In the year 1799, amidst the bustling city of New York, Constable Ichabod stands by the river and makes a grim discovery. Seeing the lifeless body floating in the water, he urgently calls out for assistance from the city guards, who quickly arrive to retrieve the body and transport it to the precinct. Eager to dive into the mystery surrounding the deceased, Ichabod approaches the senior officer, seeking permission to conduct an investigation.
Just a moment, if I may. We do not yet know the cause of death.
When you find him in the river, cause of death is drowning.
Possibly so, if there is water in the lungs. But by pathology, we might be able to determine whether or not he was dead before he went into the river.
As a visionary ahead of his era, Ichabod challenges the chief and the court regarding the treatment of prisoners. He passionately advocates against the use of medieval torture by the police, emphasizing that these brutal methods force false confessions from innocent individuals. Furthermore, he argues for the establishment of a more proficient investigative team to ensure justice and fairness in the legal system. Ichabod's fervor is met with the ire of an incensed judge, who sternly admonishes him to silence his progressive ideals. Undeterred, the judge then assigns Ichabod the task of applying his unconventional investigative methods to a remote farming community found far from the city. His mission is to unravel the mystery of the 3 decapitated bodies and to bring the murderer to justice.
You will take these experimentations of yours to Sleepy Hollow, and there you will detect the murderer. Bring him here to face our good justice.
Upon returning home, Ichabod quickly gathers his belongings and begins his journey to the secluded town. After several hours of travel, he at last arrives at the quiet village of Sleepy Hollow. As he strolls through the streets, he can't help but notice the eerie absence of any townsfolk outdoors. Each house seems to be quickly securing itself, with windows and doors being firmly locked well before the sun has fully set, leaving Ichabod with a sense of unease. As Ichabod makes his way to the home of the man who was supposed to host him, he enters to find a lively atmosphere, with the townspeople eating and drinking. As he moves through the crowd, he bumps into a beautiful young woman named Katrina, who is engaged in a game where she is blindfolded. In a playful gesture, she reaches out to touch his face, attempting to find out his identity. However, Ichabod quickly assures her that he is only a stranger. Katrina warmly gives him a genuine smile and a welcome kiss on the cheek.
Then have a kiss on account.
A gesture that leaves Ichabod pleasantly surprised. Once she takes off the blindfold, Ichabod tells her that he is looking for Baltus, and she informs him she is his daughter.
And who are you, friend? We have not heard your name yet. I have not said it. Excuse me. You need some manners.
Brom.
A few seconds later, Baltus appears and invites Ichabod to join him and a few other men for a private conversation. After settling down in his room first, Ichabod goes to attend the meeting. After a quick introduction of everyone in the room, Baltus begins to tell Ichabod about the case he would be working on, explaining about the severed heads that were never found. They tell him that they believe the heads were taken back to hell by the Headless Horseman. Asking Ichabod to be seated, they begin to tell him the story of the horseman, explaining that he was a Hessian mercenary with a love for murder. After he had killed many, the horseman met his end at the hands of soldiers who decapitated and buried him, leaving a seed of evil. The Hessian had returned 20 years later to wreak havoc once more. Despite his shaky hands, Ichabod refuses to entertain this wild tale, telling the men that he's on the hunt for a flesh-and-blood murderer whom he fully intends to bring to justice. That very night, a man, armed and ready to take on the horseman, keeps a vigilant watch on the woods. As darkness falls, an unexpected mist creeps out of the dark woods, snuffing out the fire on the piers. Suddenly, a gunshot rings out, it, forcing the man to dash through the woods, desperately trying to save his skin. Despite his frantic efforts to flee, the horseman swiftly catches up to him, resulting in a swift and headless conclusion. The next morning, Ichabod heads to the stables to fetch a horse, only to be taken aback by the news that the horseman has killed another man from the town. In a comical display of mounting his horse, complete with fumbling and flailing, Ichabod sets off for the woods, where the townsfolk have gathered around the fallen body. Using investigative methods he had learned and perfected, Ichabod begins to pick out clues as to how the events had taken place.
The wound was cauterized in the very instant, as though the blade itself were red hot, and yet no blistering, no scorched flesh.
The devil's fire.
After the funeral, the recently deceased man's son, young Masbath, approaches Ichabod and asks him if he could be of any assistance as both his parents are now dead.
Constable Crane.
Miss Philipse?
Something you should know. Jonathan Masbath was not the fourth victim, but the fifth.
The fifth?
5 victims in 4 graves.
Finding out that there were 5 deaths instead of 4, Ichabod decides that he needs all the help he can get and decides to accept the young man's help. Ichabod then decides to dig up one of the women who had been killed by the horseman and do an autopsy, discovering that the woman was pregnant when she was killed.
I am finished.
What in the name of God have you done to her?
We are dealing with a madman. The widow Winship was with child.
That night, Ichabod ventures out of his room and runs into Katrina downstairs, then asks her some questions about the town, telling him that they used to live in a broken-down cottage before her father worked hard to accumulate their wealth. Katrina offers to show him the old house.
This land we're looking at was Van Garrett land, given to my father when I was in swaddling clothes. The Van Garretts were the richest family around these parts. When my father brought us to Sleepy Hollow, Van Garrett set him up with an acre and a broken-down cottage. My father worked hard for his family, and prospered, and built this house, and I owe my happiness to him.
Right around dawn, Ichabod and Katrina head out of town so he can see the small cottage they used to live in. Later that evening, Ichabod secretly observes Baltus and the town's elders having a private conversation. Ichabod then tails the magistrate, who appears visibly distressed after departing from the meeting. Intercepting him, Ichabod confronts the magistrate, pressing for information about the father of the murdered woman's unborn child.
I was bound by my oath of office to keep the secret, but
You believe the father killed her?
the horseman killed her.
How often do I have to tell you there is no horseman? There never was a horseman. There never will be a horseman.
As the heated exchange continues, both men are taken aback by the sudden braying of a horse, their attention drawn to the horseman coming from the woods. Frozen with fear, Ichabod watches as the Headless Horseman decapitates the magistrate and takes the head with him. Paralyzed with fear, Ichabod takes a few days to come to terms with what he had seen.
It was a headless horseman.
You must not excite yourself.
But it was a headless horseman.
Of course it was. That's why you're here.
No, you must believe me. It was a horseman, a dead one, headless.
I know.
You don't know because you were not there.
After regaining his composure, Ichabod decides to solve the mystery, starting by finding the grave of the horseman. Although he had been hoping for volunteers to help him on his mission, Ichabod finds that no one is willing to volunteer and must go to it with young Masbath as his only companion. As Ichabod and young Masbath journey through the woods, they stumble upon a cave inhabited by an old witch. After an eerie conversation with her, the ancient crone cryptically provides Ichabod with a clue about the location of the horseman's grave, after accessing the other side with her mystical powers. Witnessing the witch's sudden and terrifying transformation, Ichabod decides that it's best not to linger in her cave. While trying to find the cave based on the witch's clues, the duo ran into Katrina, who had followed them to provide help as no one else would. As they venture deeper into the woods, they find the tree of the dead, and while examining them, Ichabod finds smears of blood on the trunk. Suspecting that there was more to it, the detective grabs his axe and begins to hack at its trunk, causing blood to spurt in all directions and all over his face. Once he manages to create an opening, Ichabod pulls out the bark and is startled when it reveals several severed heads. Telling the others that the three must be a gateway between worlds, Ichabod does more investigation and informs them that the ground next to the tree has been disturbed. Getting his shovel, Ichabod digs the disturbed ground and finds the skeleton of the horseman with its head missing, and realizes the ghost was stealing heads because its own was taken from it. Unexpectedly, the tree starts to shake, and out pops the horseman, leaving Ichabod and the others frozen in shock. Without so much as a glance, the horseman gallops into town and barges into a house where he murders the entire family, gathering up their heads in a sack. As the horseman makes his grand exit, Katrina's suitor, Brom, decides to play the hero, attempting to take on the figure in a valiant yet futile showdown.
Wait, he's not after you. I'll get him.
Witnessing Brom's struggle against the horseman, Ichabod rushes to aid the courageous man. However, their combined efforts proves no match for the entity. In a saddening turn of events, Ichabod sustains a severe chest wound, while the horseman inflicts a fatal blow, leaving Brom tragically and gruesomely bisected. As the dust settles, the horseman vanishes with its grim prize, leaving the two men behind in its wake. After being rescued by the townspeople, Ichabod is brought back to Baltus's house, where he receives care from the doctor. Battling a fever, Ichabod shares his belief that the horseman wouldn't have harmed them if they hadn't provoked it, suggesting that the entity had specific targets in mind.
The horseman does not kill at random. His victims are chosen by someone who controls him, by that very person who took his skull. Someone who knew where to dig. Someone of flesh and blood, as I've always said.
During his sleep, Ichabod is plagued by a haunting nightmare of his long-lost mother, causing him to jolt awake. Katrina, who has been taking care of him, envelops him in a comforting embrace, hoping to provide solace. Grateful for her support, Ichabod expresses his sympathy to Katrina, acknowledging the loss of her suitor. To his surprise, Katrina confides that while she mourns his passing, her heart remains unbroken. Having regained his strength, Ichabod resumes his investigation, assembling the scattered clues. A sudden revelation ignites an idea, urging him to seek out the notary in charge. After a series of questions, Ichabod uncovers a shocking truth that the initial victim, Peter Van Garrett, had secretly married the widow and drafted a new will, giving her and their child the estate. It dawns on Ichabod that all the victims are either beneficiaries or witnesses to this revised will. He is now sure that the horseman's master is the individual who would have inherited the estate had the new will not been enacted, which makes him suspect Baltus. Ichabod returns to the house and finds Katrina sitting and waiting for him in his room. Now suspicious of her and her family, he quickly asks her what she is doing there. Katrina explains that she wanted to see him because she missed him and conveys a message from her father, telling him that it was time for him to return to New York. After she leaves, Ichabod tries to get back to his investigation, but his focus is shattered when he spots a giant spider heading for his bed. Reacting as if he's a schoolgirl, he leaps onto a chair and begs young Masbath to take care of the eight-legged intruder. As the boy moves the bed, both Ichabod and young Masbath are taken aback to find painted symbols underneath. Young Masbath's eyes widen in exaggerated shock, and he dramatically declares that it must be witchcraft. That night, as Ichabod meticulously sifts through the evidence he has compiled, he and young Masbath are startled by the sound of movement within the house. Intrigued, they cautiously track the cloaked figure into the woods, where Ichabod is astonished to stumble upon Lady Van Tassel in a compromising situation with another man. As he watches, the woman grabs her knife and slices her palm, then rubs the blood all over the man's back. Shocked by the unexpected discovery, Ichabod quickly retreats to the safety of the house, his mind racing with the implications of what he has just witnessed. When they return to Ichabod's room, they are shocked to find his drawer wide open and all the meticulously compiled evidence missing. It dawns on Ichabod that Katrina must have taken them to protect her father. Determined to confront her, Ichabod ventures deep into the woods, where he discovers her at the very spot she had previously shown him, the location of their old cottage. Finding her exactly where he had anticipated, he confronts her about the missing evidence, accusing her of tampering with it.
You took the evidence and burned it.
So that you would not have it to accuse my father.
Without hesitation, Katrina admits to her actions, her expression a mix of guilt and desperation. Katrina rebukes Ichabod, asserting that he wouldn't make such accusations against her father if he truly knew the man. Ichabod, maintaining that he isn't accusing anyone, explains that he is simply following where the evidence leads. Unconvinced, Katrina insists that he leave her alone, telling him that he lacks compassion, and revealing that she nearly made the mistake of giving him her heart. Angry, Katrina mounts her horse and says her farewell, telling him that she curses the day he ever came into their town. When he returns to the house, Ichabod is intercepted by Lady Van Tassel, who mentions that he never asked her what happened to her hand. When he nervously begins to stutter, Lady Van Tassel tells him that she knows he has seen her with another man, and begs him not to tell her husband, Baltus. Their conversation is abruptly interrupted by a visibly agitated Baltus, who bursts into the house with news of the notary's death. He grimly explains that the man had taken his own life during the night. Baltus also cautions Ichabod that the townspeople are turning against him and advises him to leave town as soon as possible if he has any sense.
What is that?
It's careless with the kitchen knife. I will bind it later with some wild arrowroot flowers. I know where some grow.
That night, the townspeople are all gathered in the church in hopes of escaping the horseman's wrath. While Lady Van Tassel is gathering flowers to treat her wound, the Headless Horseman approaches her from behind. Her husband sees this and runs away in panic. As Ichabod watches from the door, he sees Baltus rushing toward his daughter and telling her the horseman has killed her stepmother while she was picking wildflowers. As the crowd erupts in screams at the sight of the galloping horseman, Ichabod quickly ushers everyone to safety inside the church. To his amazement, he observes that the horseman is unable to enter the consecrated grounds. Inside the church, tensions run high as Baltus and his former confidants turn on each other, ultimately deciding to offer Baltus to the horseman, believing that he is the entity's intended target. Refusing to sacrifice himself, Baltus shoots one of the townsmen and aims his gun at those around him so no one else can approach him. While announcing that there was a conspiracy and that he will seek it out, an unexpected attack from the horseman leaves Baltus impaled on a stick, which the demon then pulls back. Screaming in horror, Katrina rushes to the window and witnesses the gruesome scene as the horseman claims her father's head. Overwhelmed by the sight, she collapses unconscious. As Ichabod tends to her, he notices her finger, dusted with pink chalk from the symbols she had been drawing on the ground, the same as the one they found in his room. This discovery leads Ichabod to a shocking realization that Katrina is the master of the horseman they had been searching for all along. Reluctant to hand her over to the authorities, Ichabod bids farewell to her unconscious form, torn by conflicting emotions. As Ichabod prepares to depart, young Masbath looks on with disappointment.
Think it was Katrina, don't you?
That can never be uttered.
A strange sort of witch with a kind and loving heart. How can you think so?
I have good reason.
When his carriage arrives, Ichabod takes one last glance at the sad boy before beginning his journey. During the trip, a sudden recollection of a book prompts Ichabod to hastily open it. To his astonishment, he discovers the symbol that Katrina had been drawing and realizes that they were runes meant for the protection of a loved one. Ordering the driver to turn the carriage around, Ichabod returns to town and goes to the morgue to examine Lady Van Tassel's body. When checking the wound on her hand, Ichabod realizes that the cut was made after the woman was already dead.
No blood flow, no healing. When this cut was made, this woman was already dead.
Which means it was not Lady Van Tassel. While sitting alone in her house, Katrina is startled when she sees her stepmother, Lady Van Tassel, approaching her, and she loses consciousness. When Katrina comes to her sense, she finds Lady Van Tassel performing a spell to summon the horseman to kill her. In a chilling confession, Lady Van Tassel reveals that she orchestrated all the murders as an act of revenge. She discloses that her family's land was unjustly taken from them by her father and his landlord, driving her to orchestrate the vengeful scheme.
I lived with my father and mother and sister in a cottage not far from here. Until one day my father died, and the landlord, who had received many years of loyal service from my parents, evicted us. No one in this God-fearing town would take us in, because my mother was suspected of witchcraft.
Young Masbath, who had overheard the confession, cleverly distracts Lady Van Tassel, allowing Katrina to escape. Outside the mill, young Masbath and Katrina encounter Ichabod, who has unraveled the mystery. As they attempt to flee, they find themselves pursued by the relentless horseman. After a long chase through the woods, they finally arrive at the Tree of Death. Lady Van Tassel follows closely behind, intent on witnessing her stepdaughter's death.
Here! Take her!
However, Ichabod intervenes just in time, tackling her before the horseman can reach Katrina. Seizing the head from the bag Lady Van Tassel had been keeping, Ichabod hurls it to the horseman, who promptly reattaches it to the right position. Having gotten what he was looking for, the horseman grabs Lady Van Tassel and rides them into the Tree of Death, where they disappear to the underworld. A few days after the horrible events, Ichabod and Katrina head to New York, ready to begin their new lives.